Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One. This is a pivotal time for our nation and for our city. Each week, from now until November 4th, we will address the concerns of New Yorkers and of Americans, and how the nominees for president and vice president are addressing them and each other. We'll try to assess this extraordinary period with news and government observers and with the newsmakers themselves. It's no exaggeration to say that the state of our economy overshadows most other issues these days. The mantra of the 1992 Democratic presidential campaign now could be rewarded to, "It's the economy again, stupid." Here to help us make sense of this mess is Nicole Gelinas, columnist and contributing editor of City Journal. She's the Searle Freedom Trust Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you.
Thank you, Sheryl. I'm happy to be here.
Nicole, why don't you tell us something about what the Manhattan Institute does and what a senior fellow does?
Sure. The Manhattan Institute is a New York-based think tank. We started up because many people in the city were concerned about crime in the 1980s, the fiscal situation, the state of deteriorating infrastructure here in New York City, and wanted to find a way to get scholars together to advise politicians, elected officials, other government officials on how to best go about recovering the city from the ravages going back really into the 1970s and then the 80s. And since then, we've branched out into many other, we've kept our focus on local and state fiscal issues, crime issues, and so forth. We've also branched out into areas like healthcare and immigration. And senior fellows at the Institute are much like professors at universities. It's just that we don't teach. We do scholarly research, write papers, write articles for the newspapers, and come on shows like this so that we can have good conversations and hopefully educate the public with our perspective on what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Institute certainly has a conservative take on issues, and my understanding is you tend to be against government regulation and put a lot of trust in free markets, which conservatives do. So now we have this huge government bailout and a partial government buyout of the nation's largest banks. How does that all sit with you?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would like to make clear that I only speak for myself, but I think it's fair to say that for me, as well as other people at the Institute, we are not against government regulation. It's very clear that the government has certain key jobs, even in a society that is based on free market principles. In financial regulation, for example, I've just written an article that will come out in the next magazine on how better to regulate the financial industry. I've written for some time that regulations in the financial industry were out of date, that the problem with something like Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002, which was enacted after Enron, for example, was not that we don't need any regulations. It was that it was the wrong regulation. It diagnosed the wrong problem and thus came up with the wrong solution. So I would certainly, very clearly the events of the past few months have shown, if anybody was still agnostic about this, which I was not, that we certainly need regulations. Some regulations are good, some are bad, some are less than useful, and we need to make sure that we are putting the right regulations in place and then enforcing them.
How about the bailout and the buyout that we have? Thoughts about that? Is that the right approach?
The tragic thing is that it came to that. Yesterday was a sad day, no matter what your political persuasion in America, because what happened is you had the federal government come in and effectively say the banking industry has failed so spectacularly in its job that the only way out for the economy is for the U.S. taxpayer to pump $250 billion directly into these huge financial institutions, everyone from Citigroup to Wells Fargo to many, many other banks took this capital and will continue to take this government capital so that they can continue lending to the private sector so that the economy does not shut down. So I would say, unfortunately, it's the only approach we had left. The real problem is what we should have done 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even leading up until 2006 to avoid.
Which was what, basically?
Well, the main problem, as I see it, is that it's not that we don't know how to regulate the financial system. In fact, many of the best regulations have held up wonderfully throughout this crisis. The FDIC, for example, which regulates commercial banks, everybody knows people have worried about their bank account, gone on and looked online and found out, of course, that you, up until a few weeks ago, you had $100,000 of your bank account protected if your bank went out of business. In virtually all cases, as long as you kept your account under that amount of money, the government would step in. You could access your deposits until the next, or by the next business day. So you would not have access to your money for any period of time. And of course, over the past couple of weeks, that amount has been extended so that now all bank accounts, at least temporarily, have that guarantee. And this is something that was put in place by FDR in the 1930s because you had so many bank runs.
Okay, so that's an example, obviously, of something that worked. What wasn't working?
What wasn't working was that that regulation was put in place to deal with it had a very specific goal. You have to protect the key sources of money and credit from the worst excesses of free market speculation. Free market speculation is fine. You'll have innovation. Some things will do wonderfully, some things not so wonderfully. You need failure, but you have to protect the economy, that is the money and credit systems, from those excesses. And we saw that with the FDIC. We protected the core commercial banking system from the excesses of the stock market after the 1930s. What we failed to see is that it wasn't just the core commercial banking system that was so important to the economy. Starting in the past 25 years, that banking system in many ways was eclipsed by what some people call the shadow banking system. You had the money markets, you had the bond markets, you had the securitization markets, so that 30 years ago, if you needed a mortgage, you might go to your local bank. 10 years ago or 5 years ago, well, you didn't know it, you were going to an investor in Europe or China to get those mortgages through these investment banks. So the investment banks had really become just as important to the average American and the average business as the commercial banks, but we did not see that danger. There were several warning signs that we missed, and what's happening now is we're applying the same type of regulations that we should have applied a long time ago to protect the economy from this newer, more important side of the banking industry that just didn't exist, even 30 years ago.
Right. Is there, I know there were Americans who really balked at the idea of helping out these companies who had been so reckless, with our money. Why bail them out? And one of the things that sort of set that off was, the profligacy of some of these executives. I mean, is there any justification? I mean, you hear about, I guess it was Mr. Fuld of Lehman Brothers, which is one of the big companies that has ceased to exist, walking away with $200 to $500 million in bonuses over the last 8 years. And you hear about the people executives from AIG first partying out in, I think it was California, and now they're going partridge hunting in Britain. Is there any justification for the golden parachute that these CEOs of failed financial institutions receive? Is there any justification for that?
6 months ago, I would have said that is a matter between the shareholders and the executives and the board of directors. It's not our business what the shareholders want to pay their executives. However, it's certainly absolutely fair to say now that the taxpayer has become the provider of capital of last resort to these companies, the taxpayer does have a right to say, why are we funding this partridge hunting party? What's going to happen with executive compensation at these firms now that they have taxpayer funding, and what many investors will perceive as a taxpayer guarantee in the future. We can say that this is temporary, but the market will think the next time there is an emergency, these same type of guarantees will be available. So it is certainly untenable to have public sector money behind what is supposed to be a private sector industry. And that is not only, that goes for executive compensation, to risk-taking. There is no justification for having huge profits based on risk-taking if in the end the taxpayer is going to have to come in and provide money for these companies to prevent an economic blow-up. And I would say the solution to that is not to accept that the government has to be in the banking business. It is to make sure that we put in place the best type of long-term regulations so that we can clearly and credibly show under the next administration that in the next time this happens, spectacularly poorly managed institutions, like some of the ones you mentioned, will be allowed to fail without blowing up the rest of the economy. We have to have the ability for private sector companies, when they do a bad job, to go out of business so that that same management won't be around to continue to harm the economy. And right now, that's our biggest failure, that we had no way to allow these companies to fail.
So now we've had this federal infusion, this infusion of hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money to shore up this economy. And I guess the question is, at a time when businesses are losing money, and failing, when so many people are being laid off, where is the government going to get the money to pay for this rescue? Who's it going to be taxing?
Well, unfortunately, that's an excellent question. We've seen, on the international markets, there are ways that investors can bet either for or against the remote possibility that someday the U.S. government will go bankrupt and stop paying its own sovereign debt obligations. And certainly, I have to say that the markets still consider that to be a very, very remote prospect, but the markets have increased their prediction that will happen. It's gone from almost inconceivable to extremely unlikely. Right now, the markets think that
the U.S. could go bankrupt.
Yes, exactly. And this isn't. Right now, the markets think that the U.S. has about as much possibility of defaulting on its debt as McDonald's has. And so that's not, it might say a lot for McDonald's, but it's something that we should think about. We're taking possibly trillions of dollars in obligations on the obligation of the taxpayer. Now, we've essentially socialized the risk of the entire banking system and put it on the taxpayer's books. And we're doing this at the same time that things like Social Security, Medicare, these are no longer long-term problems. These are becoming near-term. People are retiring within the next 10 years.
But where literally does the money come from? You have, Obama and McCain mostly talking about tax cuts for various segments of the economy. Where literally would the money come from? Sure.
Right now, because we are running budget deficits and Americans do not save money on balance, the money comes from borrowing, and this is largely borrowing from international sources. The Asian governments and individuals in Asia, they are savers. They have money to put to use. Much of that money makes its way over here. The real risk to us is, one, that in this is the good case scenario, in borrowing all of this money, we are neglecting things like infrastructure, other needs at home. And the second risk is that this borrowing may not be around forever. Asian nations and individuals may say at some point, this is not the wonderful deal that we thought it was, and we'll put our money to work somewhere else. And then we've got a real problem, because we are so used to borrowing very cheaply from everything from mortgage debt to credit card debt. And this is something that could end not just for a couple of years, but indefinitely. And that's a painful readjustment for Americans to go through.
Right. We're going to take a short break, and then I'll be back with more with Nicole Gelinas of the Manhattan Institute after the following messages.
先生你好，歡迎光臨，等等先。唔該晒。Brandon.
Welcome back to One to One, and economist and business writer Nicole Gelinas of the Manhattan Institute. Nicole, among the people who are most worried about what's happening financially now are people who are either in retirement or nearing retirement and have seen their savings, their pensions, their IRAs, their 401ks shrivel up. What's going to happen to these people?
Right. This is one of the, and this is arguably the greatest tragedy to come out of this, is that we have missed opportunities in the past. After Enron, one of the most poignant scenes was people who had not only lost their jobs, but they had all or most of their retirement savings
tied up in
Enron stock. So they lost their money at the same time that they lost their jobs. And at the time, there were some bills before Congress that said that we won't allow, if you are working at a particular company, you can't have more than 10% or some small percentage of your stock holdings in that company. Some people said at the time, including myself, that we should have diversification rules, not telling people what they can and can't invest in, but saying if you are investing your money in a tax-favored account, you shouldn't be able to have half of your money in any one company or sector of the economy. The limit should be maybe 15%, 10%, pick some reasonably small number. And that way, if a big bank goes bust, you only lost 10% of your money. Maybe the rest of your holdings will decline as the market declines, but you still haven't lost, 60% or more of your money, as people who were invested heavily in stocks like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, some of the big banks have seen. And this is something where we need reasonable regulations in the future so that the market can do its job. Clearly we're not going back to the days of when a big company would guarantee your pension for life if you worked there for 35 years. And in many ways, we don't want to go back to those days, partly because that, in effect, forces a person to invest his or her entire pension in that one company. Yes, there are some government guarantees of private pensions, but they are not for the full amounts. We've seen people at steel companies in the past, for example, airlines, they thought they were going to get a particular pension, and when these companies went out of business, they got maybe half or much less than they had expected to get. So we need a way for people to use, we need a way for people to use the private markets to their advantage, but they have to do it under intelligent regulations, which we do not have right now. And another thing is fees at mutual funds companies. This is something that many people don't consider, but it takes away from your return. If you're investing in high fee firms, people need to be educated much more effectively on some of these risks.
Right. Do you hear either of the presidential candidates saying anything credible about how to fix the economy and ensure our, fiscal security?
Both candidates have said that or each candidate has said if he is elected, he expects to sign far-reaching overhaul of the financial industry regulations. However, neither one has been very specific on what he will do. We've seen Senator McCain say that he wants a way in which big companies can fail, but he hasn't said specifically how he would do that, how he would avoid a blow-up like today. Senator Obama similarly has not been too specific, and you can understand why they haven't come out with very clear plans and why their plans have changed, simply because the facts have been changing for the past 6 months as well. But after the election, the winner is going to have to be very specific about what he wants to see in a bill and what he will sign, because uncertainty, we saw in the 1930s that it took the financial industry years to get used to new regulations, in many cases good regulations. The 1933 and 1934 Securities Acts, which are still the underpinnings of our free market publicly traded companies and so forth today, but it took years to get used to these. So one of the best things that the winner can do is just say very clearly, these are the principles that I will adhere to, so that the market can immediately start to get used to that and not spend 3 or 4 years figuring out what the landscape will look like.
One thing you started getting this last week was both candidates proposing some measures aimed not at the banks and the world market, but at middle class, regular people. And, a couple of things that sort of appeal to me, Barack Obama's proposal, eliminating income taxes for senior citizens earning under $50,000 a year. And McCain, there was a similar proposal, but I can't. Oh, McCain was suggesting that we temporarily stop taxing unemployment benefits. And my question is, does it make any sense? Why do we tax unemployment benefits? Why do we tax Social Security payments, both of which are supposed to be, safety net kinds of programs?
Right. There's it is kind of a Rube Goldberg situation where you're getting money from the government. Unfortunately, if you're in the position of being unemployed, and then you're sending some of that money back to the government. So that certainly doesn't make too much sense, and that's something that should be definitely considered. As for picking out a particular block of voters, senior citizens making under $50,000, I would argue that the tax policy should be consistent. If you want to have a particular tax rate for people earning, under $50,000, under $40,000, it should be across the board, no matter what the person's age. Because the reality is that a senior citizen making, $45,000 should not be favored over a family of four making $40,000. So I don't. Some of this pandering to particular voting blocks on behalf of both candidates, I think each candidate would be better off saying, for all companies of a certain size, this will be the tax rate. For all individuals of a certain size, or certain income, this will be the tax rate. And then there's no inconsistency. There's no lobbying on K Street to get certain loopholes, and there's less business for accountants. It's easy for people and businesses to figure out what their tax burden is. One
other thing that Obama has proposed is sort of New Deal-ish kind of thing, is that we invest billions in federal money to repair the infrastructure, which is crumbling all over, and that become, and that you use, that project, I guess sort of like a modern day WPA, to put people to work. And there are a lot of people who are out of work now. What do you think of that?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question that infrastructure, 10, 15 years ago, when people started warning that infrastructure was going to be in bad shape, unfortunately, we have not invested enough in infrastructure. We have not invested what we have invested very intelligently in infrastructure, what with earmarks, bridges to nowhere, and so forth. So now here we are where infrastructure literally is crumbling, and this is not a good basis for a private sector economy. You can't build an office park and have people get there if the road is falling apart, if there's congestion and so forth. I think I would want to make sure that we understand that the purpose of infrastructure should be to create a base for private sector job creation in whatever industry, not so much to create permanent public sector jobs. And it's a wonderful thing, of course, in a time of higher unemployment, that building and repairing roads, bridges, and so forth can create jobs. But I think it is better if we consider infrastructure projects to be important as an end to themselves rather than as a means to create jobs.
Of the international markets, who's in the ascendancy now? Who's in the lead now? Is it China? Is it Russia? Who can we learn from? Is it still us? And who can we learn from?
Well, it's not Russia. We've seen, unfortunately, Russia has done very well and been able to mask very serious problems because the oil price has been so ridiculously high for the past few years. And as the price of oil comes down, global investors are starting to once again be reminded that this is a very politically unstable environment, and the Russian markets have fallen far more than our markets have fallen here over the past 6 months or so. The Asian economies, particularly China, they have done very well exporting to us. It's quite possible that they will go into recession as well, as we are purchasing fewer products, not just in America, but Western Europe as well as the
this whole global thing, was the whole thing set off by the subprime mortgage business?
It was set off partly going back to the question you asked about who's going to be in the lead. Countries like China, other developing Asian economies for the first time, they've had billions and trillions of dollars to save. We've been buying imports from them, giving them cold, hard international currency, and they have used much of that currency, or they did use it over the past 15 years to say, where do we want to invest our money? We want to invest it in the safest place around, which is the American dollar. So they, in effect, sent that money back to us, and that enabled us to have really dirt cheap interest rates for so long, and that went into everything from mortgages to credit card debts. You know, when you can borrow money almost on an unlimited basis for a cheap price, that makes it easy to buy almost any asset, whether it's a house or an office building or a toll road, and the price of that asset then goes up because there's so much demand for it. And even though, you know, the first effects of this were seen in the subprime mortgage market, that was really just the canary in the coal mine. The people who had subprime mortgages, unfortunately, were the first people who ran into distress paying these mortgages. This was the first to show up. But today we're seeing it has spread into prime mortgages, commercial office space, really anything that is a hard asset. Now that the cheap borrowing has gone away, those assets are worth much, much less.
Wow. Well, it's complicated, it's fascinating, and it's really important for us right now and going forward. And I appreciate I wish we could talk more, but I appreciate your coming here and giving us a little more insight as to what's going on. My thanks to Nicole Gelinas of the Manhattan Institute for joining me, and for the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.